He was a man who was so sickly as a child that his mother feared he would not survive, a man who was hospitalized countless times, a man who suffered from chronic pain, a man who was given the last rites of the Catholic Church on multiple occasions, a man who was so physically frail that the military initially rejected him for service. Now imagine that this same man would become the youngest person ever elected president of the United States, a man who would inspire a generation with his vision of a new frontier, a man who would stare down the Soviet Union during the most dangerous moment in human history, a man who would launch the race to the moon, a man whose assassination would shock the world and become one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. This is the story of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man who was not just a president, but a symbol of hope, a symbol of youth, a symbol of the promise of a new generation. But here is what most people do not realize about John F. Kennedy, the man who is remembered as the embodiment of Camelot, the man who gave us the Peace Corps and the space race, was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was plagued with chronic pain and illness, a man who was addicted to medication, a man who was a serial womanizer, a man who was deeply conflicted about the use of power, a man who made catastrophic mistakes, a man who was often reckless and impulsive, a man who was deeply human, and a man whose story is filled with contradictions that continue to fascinate and confound us to this day. To understand John F. Kennedy, you have to go back to the beginning, to the wealthy suburbs of Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was born on May 29, 1917, into one of the most powerful and ambitious families in American history. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a self-made millionaire, a man of immense wealth and political ambition, a man who had served as the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission and as the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, was the daughter of a former mayor of Boston, a woman of deep Catholic faith, a woman who was determined to raise her children to achieve greatness. John was the second of 9 children, a boy who was often overshadowed by his older brother, Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the golden child, the one who was destined to become the first Catholic president. John was a sickly child, a boy who was constantly battling illness, a boy who was often hospitalized, a boy who was given the last rites on multiple occasions. He was a boy who was determined to overcome his physical limitations, a boy who was determined to prove that he was worthy of his family's expectations. He was a boy who was learning to hide his pain, a boy who was learning to project an image of strength and confidence.
Kennedy was educated at the finest schools in the country, including the Choate School in Connecticut and Harvard University. He was a bright student, but he was also a rebellious one, a man who was not always interested in his studies, a man who was more interested in sports, women, and the pursuit of pleasure. He was a man who was deeply charismatic, a man who had a natural ability to connect with people. He was a man who was also deeply ambitious, a man who was determined to make his mark on the world. He graduated from Harvard in 1940 with a degree in government and a thesis that would later be published as a book, Why England Slept. The book was a bestseller, a sign of his intellectual ambition and his political potential. He was a man who was preparing for his future, a man who was determined to follow his father's advice. It's not what you are that counts, it's what people think you are. The turning point in his life came in 1941 when he joined the U.S. Navy. His father used his influence to secure him a position in the Office of Naval Intelligence, and later he was assigned to command a PT boat in the Pacific Theater. It was a dangerous assignment, a job that was considered to be one of the most hazardous in the Navy. In August 1943, Kennedy's boat, PT-109, was rammed by a Japanese destroyer and split in half. He was thrown into the water, and he was seriously injured. He was a man who was in agony, a man who was suffering from a back injury that would plague him for the rest of his life. He led his crew to safety, swimming for hours, towing one of his wounded men by holding the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. It was an act of extraordinary courage, a moment that would define his leadership and his legacy. He was a man who was determined to save his crew, a man who was determined to survive. He was a man who was beginning to be seen as a hero. After the war, Kennedy entered politics, running for the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts in 1946. He won, and he served 3 terms in the House. He was a man who was learning the art of politics, a man who was developing the skills that would make him a great leader. He was also a man who was deeply ambitious, a man who was determined to achieve higher office. In 1952, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, defeating the Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. He was a man who was on the rise, a man who was being groomed for the presidency. He was also a man who was struggling with his health. He was diagnosed with Addison's disease, a rare and potentially fatal condition. He was forced to wear a back brace, and he was often in intense pain. He was a man who was hiding his illness, a man who was determined to project an image of strength and vitality.
In 1956, Kennedy narrowly missed being selected as the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. The loss was a disappointment, but it was also a learning experience. He was a man who was determined to be patient, a man who was determined to wait for his moment. In 1960, he announced his candidacy for the presidency. He was a man who was facing a tough challenge, a man who was running against a formidable opponent, Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president. He was a man who was also facing a significant obstacle, his religion. He was a Catholic, and many Americans were suspicious of a Catholic president. He addressed the issue directly in a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, assuring the nation that he would not be influenced by the Vatican. He was a man who was determined to overcome every obstacle, a man who was determined to achieve his dream. The 1960 election was a turning point in American history. Kennedy was a man who was charismatic, a man who was telegenic, a man who was able to connect with voters on a personal level. He was a man who was also deeply intelligent, a man who was well-informed, a man who was prepared to lead. He won the election by a narrow margin, becoming the youngest person ever elected President of the United States. He was 43 years old. His inaugural address was a masterpiece of oratory. He told the nation, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It was a call to action, a moment that captured the hopes and aspirations of a generation. He was a man who was determined to lead the nation into a new era of progress and prosperity. The next 2 years were a period of intense political activity. Kennedy launched the Peace Corps, a program that sent American volunteers to developing countries around the world. He also launched the space race, declaring that the nation would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. He was a man who was determined to inspire the nation, a man who was determined to achieve greatness. But his presidency was also marked by crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the most dangerous moment in human history. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, a direct threat to the United States. Kennedy was confronted with a choice: to invade Cuba, which could have led to a full-scale nuclear war, or to negotiate a peaceful solution. He was a man who was under immense pressure, a man who was making decisions that could determine the fate of the world. He chose to negotiate, and he was able to secure a peaceful resolution. It was a moment of triumph, a moment of great leadership. He was a man who had stared into the abyss and had refused to flinch. He was a man who had proven that he was capable of handling the most dangerous crises.
Kennedy's personal life was also marked by struggle. He was a man who was in constant pain, a man who was struggling with his health, a man who was addicted to the medication that was supposed to relieve his suffering. He was a man who was a serial womanizer, a man who had a series of extramarital affairs, including a rumored relationship with Marilyn Monroe. He was a man who was deeply conflicted, a man who was often reckless and impulsive. He was a man who was also a devoted father, a man who loved his children deeply. He was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the contradictions of his own personality. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was riding in an open-top motorcade when he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. He was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. He was 46 years old. His assassination was a moment of profound grief for the nation, a moment that shook the world. He was a man who had been cut down in his prime, a man who had been robbed of the future he had been determined to build. His death became one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, a subject of endless speculation and debate. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone, but many people have questioned that conclusion. The assassination has become a symbol of the loss of innocence, a moment when the promise of a new generation was shattered. The legacy of John F. Kennedy is one of the most profound in American history. He is remembered as a symbol of hope, a symbol of youth, a symbol of the promise of a new generation. He is celebrated as a leader who inspired the nation, a man who challenged the nation to reach for greatness. He has been honored with a memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, a library in Boston, and a place in the pantheon of American heroes. He is a man who is considered one of the greatest presidents in history. But his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was plagued by illness and addiction, a man who was a serial womanizer, a man who was often reckless and impulsive. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the contradictions of his own personality. Why should someone born today still care about John F. Kennedy? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the importance of vision. He was a man who was not content to accept the world as it was, a man who dared to imagine a better world, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to make that vision a reality. He showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. Kennedy once said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." He was a man who believed in the power of challenge, a man who believed that the greatest achievements are born from the greatest struggles. He was a man who was not afraid to fail, a man who was not afraid to struggle, a man who was not afraid to sacrifice. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a president, he was a man who was a symbol, a man who was a legend, a man whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but hope. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.